Welcome to Global Ethics Review. I'm Alex Woodson from Carnegie Council, the world's catalyst for ethical action. In this podcast series, we'll be connecting Carnegie Council's work and current events with our senior fellows, senior staff, and friends of our organization. You'll hear from leading experts on artificial intelligence and technology, migration, public health, and U.S. foreign policy and global engagement. In this podcast, we'll pick up on our series on the ethics of vaccine nationalism with Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. He is Vice President for Global Initiatives and the Diane V.S. Levy and Robert N. Levy University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. The previous podcasts in this series, which were posted in June and July of this year, have discussed the COVID-19 pandemic and the idea that vaccine-rich nations have an ethical obligation to share doses with the rest of the world. This is discussed in great detail in the article on the ethics of vaccine nationalism, the case for the fair priority for residence framework. This was published online on October 29, 2021 by Carnegie Council's Ethics and International Affairs Journal and Cambridge University Press. Dr. Emanuel is the lead author on this article, which was co-authored by a group of philosophers and global health experts from around the world. For a link to this article and previous podcasts with article co-authors Cecile Fabre and Florencia Luna, please go to carnegiecouncil.org. In our talk recorded last Friday, Dr. Emanuel and I caught up on some current issues and how they play into the fair priority for residence framework that he and his group of co-authors propose. We spoke about boosters, vaccine hesitancy, and Biden administration policies, including the travel ban on Southern African countries due to the new Omicron variant of COVID-19. But first, since a lot of the conversation is focused on the fair priority for residence framework, here is Dr. Emanuel's description of this policy from our talk in July 2021.
We've been trying to ask the question, how do we fairly distribute vaccines for COVID among countries? And how should that distribution happen? And there are really, you might say, two broad components to it. One component is, once you've got some vaccine, how do you pick which countries should get the vaccine and how much? And we call that the fair priority model. And the fair priority model says you should distribute it on the basis of need. And then we go on to analyze, what does medical need mean? And we highlight that first, it should encompass deaths due to COVID, both directly caused by COVID, so someone dies of COVID, and indirectly, because the healthcare system's overwhelmed, people can't get to the hospital, or people stay away with their heart attacks or their births and unfortunately die from that. And then it should consider morbidity related to COVID, but also socioeconomic burdens. Now, obviously, the socioeconomic lockdowns are related to mortality. Once the mortality goes down, the socioeconomic lockdowns tend to ease. So that's one component. Once you've got vaccine, how do you distribute it among countries? And basically the idea is need, anticipating which countries the vaccine is going to do the best to limit the number of deaths and socioeconomic dislocation. There's also a question of, when a country has vaccine, when does it have to distribute the vaccine and share it? And that's a question that the fair priority for residence addresses, and it says at the absolute maximum, you can't argue that we should vaccinate everyone in the country. You might be able to argue that we can vaccinate till we get herd immunity, but there is the question is there a threshold below herd immunity where you should vaccinate? You should share your vaccine before giving it to your own population. And that's where this principle of the fair priority to residence goes. Yes, countries should prioritize their residents. We don't have a world government that functions, so national governments have to function and protect their own citizens. But they shouldn't hold on to vaccine below once they've reduced mortality below a threshold, and that threshold we call the flu-like threshold, which is, when does a COVID cease being a pandemic and an emergency, and when does it become background risk? Well, that's kind of like when COVID is like the flu. And, just to give listeners a sense, in the United States, a not bad flu season has somewhere between 36,000 and 60,000 deaths. That's about 100 deaths to 150 deaths a day. And so that gives you a sense for when. Now, once you've gotten COVID deaths down to that level, the government really is obliged to share the vaccine with other very hard-hit countries.
For more from this talk and the Vaccine Nationalism podcast with Cecile Fabre and Florencia Luna, please go to carnegiecouncil.org. But for now, here's my most recent talk with Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So we last talked in late June about coronavirus pandemic and a lot of the issues associated with that and with vaccines, vaccine nationalism versus cosmopolitanism. Since then, a lot has happened. We've had the Delta variant. We've had a lot of vaccine hesitancy in the US. We have discussion about boosters. And your article has also been published by Cambridge University Press and our Ethics and International Affairs Journal. So I'm just curious if your thinking has changed at all in the last few months. We'll get to the Omicron variant, but I'm just wondering if your thinking has changed in the last few months about the fair priority for residence framework and how that should be approached now that we're kind of in this new world.
No, I think the fair priority for residence framework is probably the right one to go on and to utilize. I would say one thing, which I do think adds another ripple, is just to see the kind of vaccine nationalism by low and middle income countries. It is not only, and I think there's a lot of attention to, the United States, Canada, the EU, and condemning their vaccine nationalism. But let's face it, India, probably linchpin to getting vaccines to developing countries, had enormous vaccine nationalism, still does. And I think there's a sort of undertone, and maybe I'm mischaracterizing it, of, well, that's understandable. Why is it any more understandable than vaccine nationalism in a big democracy like the United States? It does seem to me we have to recognize in this world that that's a natural reaction of a government, and at least on many interpretations, a legitimate democratic governments are elected to serve their citizens and to keep them healthy and safe. And they gain their legitimacy from fulfilling that promise. And in the absence of a world government or an effective world order, that's the best way we know how to protect people's lives. So I think it is a kind of natural thing. We do have to limit it because governments have other obligations. But I think seeing this vaccine nationalism on lots of developing countries' parts, it should make us very attuned to the fact that this is, in some ways, I want to say natural. Obviously, states are unnatural, but a natural reaction by a government which aims to be legitimate by its people.
So just to continue on that point, does vaccine nationalism look the same in India or other developing countries as it does in the United States and Canada? Or talking about hoarding vaccines, issues like that, or does it take a different form depending on?
I don't know that I'd be honest. What is the essence of vaccine nationalism? That we should get vaccines before we share them. Now, whether it's we should get boosters before we share them, or we should get first, second doses before we share them, I think it's the same basic ethical issue. Now, that doesn't mean the analysis is the same. We should get first doses is very different than we should get boosters, or that every adult in our population should get a booster. I think that's frankly, a weaker argument for a government to make than we should get our population first doses. So the complexion, but the structure of the argument in terms of a nationalism claim is, I think, the same. Our primary obligation is to protect our own, which I think is valid, but that's not the only obligation. And everyone who's sophisticated recognizes that in addition to that as a primary obligation, you often have to weigh obligations against each other and duties. That's part of what make ethical dilemmas and trying to find the right answer to those ethical dilemmas.
So you mentioned boosters, and that's one of the topics that I want to discuss today. I'm not sure if boosters were in mind when you were writing the paper. What boosters were in mind with the fair priority residence for fair priority for residence framework. So I mean, maybe they were, maybe I'm wrong, but how do the boosters change the calculation when you're talking about sharing vaccine doses? When a lot of people in the United States, or I'm about to get my third dose, a lot of people in developing nations haven't had their first one. So how should we think about that?
Well, we can think about it from the individual standpoint and then the sort of governmental national standpoint. From the individual standpoint, you know, Alex, if you don't get your booster and say, you know, I shouldn't get my booster when there are whatever, you know, 4 billion people around the world who haven't even gotten a first dose, that's irrelevant. Your shot is not going to Peru or to South Africa or wherever it may be. And I think from an individual standpoint, you can't control, you know, your foregoing does not get it somewhere else. It probably puts it in a refrigerator in Atlanta or something like that. So I think go ahead and get your booster. But I think from a national standpoint, from how should it be prioritized, it does make a difference. As I said, the risk, you know, we have to look at what are the risks and benefits, who's going to benefit, how much are they going to benefit, what are the risks to you of not getting a booster. And, you know, if you're under 55 for sure, the booster is probably not that important. I mean, there was obviously even tension among the advisory boards in the United States as to whether all adults should get it or just the older adults who are, and those who are at risk because of comorbidities. And you saw there was recently an op-ed in the Washington Post, I believe, by the former heads of the vaccine group at FDA, talking about the fact that they didn't see vaccinating all adults as the right answer. So I think this is the way I would put it. The framework is the same. The actual calculations, and again, a good ethical framework will be sensitive to the empirical facts of the situation, are important. If we got a variant, which for some reason was much more virulent among young people, well, then it would change the calculation in terms of the importance of, and the booster was really effective against it, then it would change the calculation about the boosters. But that's the framework, the ethical reasoning, I think, of the fair priority for residence model remains the same.
Another issue that I wanted to discuss in relation to the fair priority for residence model and just new information coming in, maybe changing your thinking, is vaccine hesitancy. So you have a country like the United States, which is sharing a lot of doses where there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy. I believe we have about 70% of people vaccinated. I'm not sure if it's going to get much greater than that. People seem very entrenched in their views right now. And then you might be sharing with countries that are also vaccine hesitant. Not sure about the numbers in other countries, but I know there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy throughout the world. So I guess kind of a two-part question. Did you expect this much vaccine hesitancy in the United States and around the world? And how does that, and now that we're here, how does that change your thinking about distributing these doses?
Well, I think vaccine hesitancy is it's a real problem, and I think it's a conundrum that probably no one anticipated, at least to this level. First of all, the linking of vaccines, especially in COVID, with cultural, political, that gamish, which has now become, I would say, somewhat of a cesspool and a negative. I use cesspool because it's a negative effect. Somehow not getting a vaccine is a cultural identity and a political, I mean, it's all mixed in together, and that's terrible. We have, so 60% of the population, give or take a few tenths of a percent, are vaccinated in the United States. That includes babies. And we've plateaued. That's it. The first doses are really low. You're seeing lines now because of Omicron at pharmacies, but that's not lines of lots of people rushing to get their first dose. I don't think all of that all the unvaccinated people are hesitant people. Some of them are truly hesitant, and no matter what, they would rather lose their very good jobs at hospital systems and whatever than get vaccinated. There's that group. That's probably a smallish group, around 10%. Then there's a very wide swath of people. I'm concerned about my kid. I want to delay. I want to see more data. I haven't gotten around to it. I might be concerned, but whatever. It's just not a focus of my life for whatever reason. And, plenty of people have lots of other burning issues. Those are the people who are persuadable by mandates, in my opinion. Let me make point two, and we'll I'm sure get back to mandates, because it's something I feel passionate about. Point two is this hesitancy is, again, not unique to the United States. While we may have it in an extreme version and more vocal version, you see it all over Europe. There are, and it has slightly different, but also slightly overlapping sources. Go to Switzerland and parts of Germany, and you have this very strong naturopath, alternative medicine groups, and they are just as much anti-vaxxers. Low levels of vaccination in Switzerland, highly educated population, white, very rich, just a population that should be very high on the vaccine, not very high on vaccination rates. And a lot of that's because of the naturopath views. And, knowing those people and having talked to, there are plenty of people who I'm strong body. I go mountain climbing all the time. And, that's going to be much more important to protect me. And it's yeah, well, not really. And you see it in Africa. Everyone talks about we're not sending enough vaccine there. Well, a big problem in lots of places that in Africa that actually haven't been able to distribute their vaccine is hesitancy. People are connecting that back to colonialism. I'm not sure it's colonialism. And I think this is just, we're often given to facile explanations. Oh, they've been exploited and that's why. Over the last 20 years, maybe even 30 years, the average life expectancy in most sub-Saharan African countries has gone way up, even including AIDS. And shockingly, that's not because of avoiding Western medicine. It's exactly because we've made Western medicine available. If, in fact, all they were exploited by Western medicine, then all this push for HIV drugs would have been ridiculous. The fact is that the access to Western medicines for HIV, but for vaccines of other kinds, for non-tropical diseases, for malaria, have made huge differences to the life expectancy of in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm not sure that the connection is, oh, I'm going to be exploited by these companies. I think much more, you've got just a worldwide situation of distrust, which is not very well grounded, except very well fueled by social media.
Yeah, there's a lot of points there that we'll come back to. And I definitely want to talk about mandates kind of towards the end of the conversation.
Sure.
Let's move on to Southern Africa, though, as you just mentioned. So I'm not sure if you saw this tweet, and this is going to tie into some domestic issues.
I don't tweet, so I don't know. I don't read tweets regularly, so I don't know.
Okay. Well, in any case, I'm just using this tweet to just make a point. This is from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on November 29th. And I'm sure you've heard the sentiment. Maybe you've not seen this tweet. He wrote, "I'm deeply concerned about the isolation of Southern African countries due to new COVID-19 travel restrictions. People of Africa cannot be blamed for the morally low levels of vaccinations available and should not be penalized for sharing health information with the world." So I think you touched on a little bit of that before when you were talking about vaccine hesitancy in some of these African nations. But what do you think about his thoughts about the travel ban? How, whether or not they're vaccine hesitant, they're in a very different situation than people in the United States and Western Europe are, and these countries in Southern Africa are bearing the brunt of this travel ban at the moment. So do you think this travel ban is warranted? And maybe if you don't want to speak specifically about this because this is still a developing situation, maybe just a thought on travel bans in general when it comes to infectious diseases and crossing borders.
Well, let's just be clear. Unless you're going to do China, which is we're sealing our borders, you come into the country, you're 21-day incubation.
And by the way, this doesn't apply just to foreigners. It also applies to Chinese coming back who've been overseas. Travel bans are not going to keep a virus out, and we know that. And you know, if you have a travel ban like we have in the United States, no foreigners from these countries can come in. But if you're an American citizen and you've been there, or you're a permanent resident and you've been there, you can come in. Who's the guy who brought it into San Francisco? I think that's the only one we have really well characterized, right? Okay, been there, American citizen, vaccinated. It's like, okay, you got a porous ban. It's just not going to be that effective. What it is going to do is slow things down a little bit. That's the best it's going to do, and we should know that. And I agree with Gutierrez's sentiment. We shouldn't penalize them. So how do we compensate them while trying to slow things down? There is an advantage to slowing something down, especially at this moment. We don't know enough about this virus. Is it more virulent? How effective are the current vaccines? How effective are the potential medications that might be authorized, or I guess in the Merck case have been authorized? Getting that information would help. Slowing things down would help. But we shouldn't be under any illusion that a travel ban is going to hermetically seal us, unless, again, we're going to do China. And we're not going to, no Western country has done China. And we're not going to do China, as far as I can tell. And so we should be very clear, this buys us a few days to a few weeks at most.
In your position as a medical doctor, do you think about, or should people who are advising President Biden and other leaders think about the politics of this, especially coming off the Trump administration and the travel bans there, and his what he's said about African countries, and now President Biden is coming in, supposedly a new chapter in America, and he's banning African countries as well. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but you can see the argument there. So how do you?
Well, let's be, a lot depends upon what you mean by politics. So if you're in the policy world,
or optics, maybe.
Well, if you're in the policy world and you're making national policy, you have to consider effectiveness. You have to consider, will the public follow you, or will you make, I mean, you can make a policy and the public doesn't follow, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And I can tell you, having advised many, many politicians, governors and others about what to do, a big part of that is, well, can I get the public to accept this? Now that has to be balanced against, is it ethical to do, even if you could get the public? I mean, sometimes the public accepts things that are totally unethical and you don't want to affirm them. You know, racism and lynching is one of those. So we have to be able to carry the public with us. And I think one of the things, you know, Joe Biden is nothing if not a very astute politician with a good nose for what the middle of America will accept. And one of the things I think, you know, my job is to try to push them to where I think they need to be. His job is to feel how fast he can go. Now, sometimes politicians get it wrong. You know, we can look at FDR, and there are a lot of things that FDR had a great nose for, but also he was probably too slow in doing certain things, certainly on racial justice. Just an example, healthcare may be another example where he probably could have gotten more had he pushed it more. And you can see some of this in Harry Truman. You know, we're going to desegregate the army. I don't care what the public says. I don't care what anyone says. It's the right thing to do. We're going to do it. So a politician is always balancing these things of, can I get the public to go along? Do I have the authority? Can I set the right precedent? So I think ethics is but one consideration when you're governing. You know, doing the right thing and no one following you does no good. So you have to marry these up, and it's hard to get everything perfect, because part of what you do when you make policy is you change people's attitude. So it's a bit of a circle which could be reinforcing positively, could be reinforcing negatively, and a good politician has to make that call. I haven't agreed with all of Joe Biden's calls. I, for example, do not agree with his call about travel mandates, which I've been pushing really hard. but I understand where he's coming from. And I think, it's too facile if you haven't been in those shoes just when you're either giving advice or having to make the decision to say, I'm not paying attention to the politics. You have to pay attention to public legitimacy and public sentiment.
Just to continue on with the Biden administration, something that you said in our last interview, which I thought was really interesting. You said that the countries that effectively fought COVID-19, especially when it first started, were countries that created a command center, I think you said. You mentioned Taiwan. Australia did a good job of that. You said that Operation Warp Speed was a good example of that in the United States. So have you seen Biden do this? I know he just put out his winter COVID plan. This will come out in a few days, but that plan just came out, I think, yesterday. So what's your sense of Biden and this idea of a national command center?
I think that's a excellent question. So when the administration came in, they had a playbook and they were executing against that playbook. And I think they did a really good job. We were at a very low, we had some vaccines, we were at a low vaccination rate. We need to get them out to different populations and multiple venues so people could access them easily. We need to take down the pricing. We need to make it convenient, cheap, or free, educate people about it, all that. And I think they executed incredibly well against it. And you can see it in the graphs, frankly. By June, we were as low as we'd been since the previous March. So June 2021 compared to March 2020, I don't think we had gotten as low in terms of cases or fatalities. And then Delta hit, and that threw a spanner into things. So I think that was good. But you have to remember, part of what needed to be done was not just the vaccines. You had a whole panoply of things. Testing. Well, we took our eye off the ball of testing, and that's never been good in this country. And the latest announcement of getting free tests at pharmacies and getting the insurance companies to pay for that. It's good. It's really important to get it so people can get free tests, or at least very, very low cost tests. I actually don't think free is probably the right price point. I think $1 is probably the right price point unless you're on Medicaid or something. But that should have been done 6 months ago. Therapeutics, assuming the Pfizer drug gets approved, Paxlovid gets approved, you have a very small window, 3 days, to get someone who's symptomatic or tested positive onto the drug. And I think that turns out to be a lot harder to do. And putting in an infrastructure where everyone who tests positive gets this drug, that's going to be hard. And, that's a perfectly made for inequities, because I'm rich, I have a primary care doctor, I can be sure. But if you don't have a primary care doctor, you don't have insurance, blah, 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 how are you going to get that? So I think that's a serious, serious problem that we haven't actually gotten. Two other things where I think maybe we took our eye off the ball. So one is, getting the vaccine right, and getting then testing, therapeutics, air quality, having a HEPA filter in every single classroom, in all public buildings. Another thing where, we allocated $34 billion, $43 billion, I can't even remember now, for education upgrades and improvements. Part of that should have been HEPA, spend it on HEPA filters, or show us that your heating and air conditioning is MERV 13 or better. Having high quality and public buildings everywhere upgraded to that. I think that's really important. And then the last area where, again, I think we haven't executed as well as we should is the whole mask thing. We got screwed up in May with the CDC saying, you're vaccinated, take your mask off. And, then slam just a few weeks later with, it's Delta, no, put your mask back on. But also the emphasis on high quality masks. Cotton masks just don't cut it. Having an N95, NIOSH approved, made in the USA, so you don't have any false ones from China that really aren't N95 respirator. Very important. Sending them out, making them easily available to people who can't afford them, whether sending them to students at school, etc. I think those are kinds of things, again, I would like to see a command center to execute on.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the mandates in the United States.
Yeah.
So you've been a big proponent of mandates. So what's your, I'm sure you have your answer ready. So what's your answer for people who say mandates take away our rights? We should be able to do what we want. This is America, freedom, and all that. So what's your answer to that when it comes to vaccine mandates?
I don't even think any serious libertarian could possibly defend the idea that I should have a right to infect you, or I should have a right to get sick and then expect you through this thing called health insurance to pay for me when there's an effective therapy and it's free. This is a non-argument. It's just grabbing at a phrase that makes you feel good. So I'll just tell a little story here. I had a Republican, prominent Republican person, not a politician, but in the Republican circles, say, every time we would get to policy and there was something that someone didn't like, from Texas especially, they would get up and say, liberty, and walk out. Like, as if that were an answer to everything. My freedom, we should have reasonable gun restrictions, liberty, we should be wear seatbelts, wear bike helmets if you're riding a motorcycle, liberty. It's like, no. The people who defended that and gave an intellectual framework for that clearly recognized your liberty stops at my nose. And if you're breathing and your breathing increases my risk, you don't have that right. You have to figure it out and change it. And so this is just nonsense, just nonsense. And we have lots of mandates. You cannot drive a car without a license. You have to pay your taxes. We can go on and on. You can't build any house you want. There are rules. You need to you can't have lead paint for also, and it's not because you're going to chew on the paint, but some kid might chew on the paint. I mean, there are all sorts of rules of a society where we're cheek by jowl. Wearing a mask or getting a vaccination, just part of being in a society. And one of the things this liberty idea fails to take account of is that you can't be part of a society without some compromise with others and balancing of your rights and others' interests too. And I think it's, individual rights don't trump everybody else. They are, that they need to be put in a context to make sure other people's rights work.
So when it comes to COVID-19, what specific mandates do you think would have an effect to fight the pandemic right now?
So look, the biggest thing with the pandemic is quite clearly we have to get the unvaccinated vaccinated. That's way more important than getting boosters. That's the question. What mandates are we going to put in place that get the unvaccinated? I think this employer mandate through OSHA, very, very important. I wouldn't have cut it off at 100. I would have cut it off much further down. I think it's absolutely essential that that happened. And the court decisions that have suspended that just make no sense at all. It's quite clear, when you look at things like Tyson Foods or the 4 million retail workers who are really at the front end and heavily exposed to the public and on, That mandate, a domestic travel mandate for planes, trains, where you have to be vaccinated, not just wear a mask, because let me assure you, wearing a mask, people are, first of all, have high quality masks inconsistently, below the nose is a very common. I'm having a sandwich, or I'm having a drink, I'm going to take my mask off. Well, what good is the mandate? So I think those are important. And then we know that they're effective, because these people who are on the fence get tilted off the fence. And the number of people who are willing to sacrifice their job or not willing to fly are small, just really small. Now, obviously, if you're going to have a mandate to fly or take a train, you need some electronic verifications. Those little cards that are on paper that are easily forged, don't work.
So, final question, and this is a tough question. It's just something that I've been thinking about. It just really amazes me 2 years in how different the pandemic looks in different parts of the country. You have New York City, where everyone wears masks on, where I am, where everyone wears masks on the train. Not everyone, most people. We have the vaccine mandates, and the infection rate's been pretty low in New York City for a while. In rural areas, obviously, it's very different. Different cities have different rules when it comes to masks, when it comes to vaccines. So again, this is not an easy question to end on, but I'm just going to throw it out there. How do you make effective policies in this country right now when you have different regions that are just wildly different in terms of how they accept basic science and how they think about these rules that you and I might think are common sense?
Yeah, I think it's when you have someone like Ron DeSantis clearly running for the presidency, using this as a differentiator and the fundamental basis on which he's going to attack Biden. It clearly means, I think, federalism is failing in this area. And, this is an interstate issue. It's not something in the states. I think we need to have a different understanding of things like public health. But it's not only public health. All of us are impacted. I mean, the irony is all of us are impacted by what happens within a state. And not just on infectious diseases, lots of things. Right? Education within a state makes a huge difference. The rate at which you tax your citizens and expect, we have lots of federal matching grants where the matching grants is related to the income level of a state. Well, state policies affect that income level. It's not an exogenous variable. It's very endogenous that depends upon what states do, and not taxing and not investing in your citizens has a very negative effect on incomes and growth. Well, why is a state able to, and this is a classic case of an externality, making all the rest of us pay for your policies? So I think if anything, this has shown the limits of federalism. Now we need states to implement and do other things, because having one government for 330 million people, it's too remote. There are lots of legitimate critiques of it, but having states able to negate federal policies that are based on science and things, where the federal government is doing a lot of the paying, seems to me to be ought to be a non-starter. And anyway, that's, I think, really one of the key lessons here, and it's going to be difficult for us to really get effective public policies in infectious disease, especially once we pay so much. It's not like states are paying a lot for their public health infrastructure. That's really a federal government. We end up shoveling a lot of money to states, and I think it's going to have to come with bigger strings.
Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the great interview.
That was Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, Vice Provost for Global Initiatives and Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the lead author of On the Ethics of Vaccine Nationalism, the Case for the Fair Priority for Residence Framework. This was published online on October 29, 2021 by Carnegie Council's Ethics and International Affairs Journal and Cambridge University Press. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Thanks for listening to Global Ethics Review. Stay safe and healthy.